Reverend Charlotte Harris not only witnessed much of the 20th century and the new millennium, she's helped shape it. Her foundation of faith has made her fearless here at McCarty Memorial Christian Church and across the country, from protests to prayer, from racism to reconciliation. Reverend Harris speaks frankly about her experiences in the church and her thoughts about its past, present, and future. This is Charlotte Harris. This is her story. This is history.
I was born in 1946 in April. I got here early. I was premature, the daughter of John and Celeste Harris in Los Angeles, California.
It was the end of the Depression, and Harris's mother and father migrated to the West Coast in the 30s in search of a better life and more opportunity. Harris's childhood brought opportunity to meet a diverse group of people.
It was 1950, so we're 5 years from the World War II. So this neighborhood not only had white families, it had Jewish families. These were the grandchildren of persons who had been affected by the Holocaust, had been in the camps. We had those persons who had been in the internment camps that were Japanese, their grandchildren. That's who's going to school with me now. I'm 5 years old. My worldview in that classroom was we were together, we could learn together.
But Harris says fear and flight took over her neighborhood.
The neighborhood changed and people were disappearing. My friends were moving. You had the Santa Monica 10 freeway coming through, and so the neighborhood was being undercut. Yes, but the view would change. And with that view, and because the community changed, there was the beginning of the church looking at integration. Yeah, so the biggest problem as a child, and even though explained by my parents, was accepting the fact that my friends were gone.
And that diversity was gone.
The diversity was gone, but they were my friends. As a child, you don't talk about diversity. My friends were gone, okay? You could see it. You know, the quality as well as what was happening on West Adams. The businesses were leaving, so the money was leaving. And because the money was leaving, you knew that the character of the neighborhood had changed. Businesses leave that could service the community. That means that's an economical loss.
When you look back at that period of history, what's the message?
That people had not learned to get along, that there was something much wrong, that friends could not remain friends because everybody was moving somewhere else. As a child, now when you talk about a 10-year-old world, my mother at her knee was teaching me history, that I learned that the world was dangerous too. After all, the Jewish family that owned the liquor store, he had brought his wife home from Europe. On her wrists were the numbers from the concentration camp. And when I saw her wrist from the concentration camp, I knew what it was.
Harris's foundation of faith kept her strong in the midst of loss, pain, and the reality of the world around her.
The faith story in my life started when I was born. My grandmother's sister was an evangelist, my Aunt Lita. Aunt Leela, I was told, the story goes, I was so tiny because I was a premature child, having been in the hospital for 6 months when I was born because I was so tiny. But they said that she put me in a shoebox and she read scriptures to me.
Your foundation was in the AME church.
Yes.
But then you decided to go to a different church than your parents.
I didn't just decide. There were some reasons why.
Harris's mother was sick. The AME church was on the east side, and her family lived on the west side.
It's about the summer of 1957. My cousins came to visit. There were about 4 or 5 of my cousins had come to visit. And Mother said, we can go to Sunday school. So she said, why don't you go up to McCarty? Now, she knew that McCarty was intentionally trying to have a church that was integrated. But we went as young people. We walked to church. Now, from this house to McCarty is about 12 blocks.
Senior pastor of McCarty Memorial Christian Church, Reverend Kring Allen, had a goal: to integrate the once all-white congregation. He, with the help of his staff, took to the streets with a budget of just $200 a month to spread the word.
He would take an evangelistic team. 3 or 4 elders would come with him, and they would do house visits because they were asking people, would they please come to McCarty, because their goal was integration. And they were seeking to revision and to vitalize and make the church relevant.
In the following years, Harris says Sunday school and vacation Bible school attendance skyrocketed at McCarty to more than 100 kids, rekindling her hope and faith after feeling abandoned.
And I could see it trying to be carried over in my church life. Okay? So it was a carryover, and I understood the church not at struggle, but willing to restore the community that had been broken by white flight and people moving.
As you grew in McCarty,
Yes.
social activism. Let's talk about the protest in the middle of church by the youth.
It was Youth Week, and the Board of Education at church had a banquet for the young people. They didn't ask us to participate. They didn't ask us to do anything. So I gathered up everybody and said, we need to protest the actions of the board. First of all, did we have any hand in planning the menu? No. Did we plan the program? No. Did they take any time to do it? No. So we walked in church in protest.
And what happened?
Parents divided and conquered. They went to find out, did the kids know why they were protesting? One of the members, I'll never forget this, Mr. Oliver Mitchell. He was an elder, said to me, your protest was logical. It was well principled. One of my lessons I learned is who has the power. He said, knowing the way the Christian church is designed and who sits on boards, I was scared that you kids would have more votes on the board than the adults. So I'm not supporting you because you will take over and you don't know what you're doing.
What was your response?
My response was, very principled, that number one, that Jesus had kicked out the money changers from the temple, and that it was inappropriate that you had an event that was for us. You didn't consult us. We're not roebucks. And if Jesus could go to the temple at age 12, I knew that we could stand up and address the board.
Some members wanted Charlotte out, but Reverend Kring Allen insisted on Charlotte staying.
That changed the voting structures in the boards so that young people were put on the boards so that their voices could be heard in how church was being churched.
Reverend Harris got the attention of church members and the board in this very sanctuary. But her passion for social justice drove her to issues on a national level in the Disciples Church. The 1969 General Assembly in Seattle, Washington.
And we decided when to hit the convention floor. It was just before the announcements of the business of the day. Byron Codon watched us come across the convention floor with balloons and said, "Excuse us." And we went up in front and we marched and we told them. And everyone said, "Wait just one moment." And we told them about, we're not going to your war. Old men talking about young men going to war. And we list the other things, but the real thing that changed, we have 7 voting delegates and there are 400 young people here. And that got everybody in the convention. Wait just one moment. These kids are making sense. And from then on, we didn't have to worry about getting conventions.
You had no fear. You were fearless.
I think he would be right. As a young person, I had, there was nothing to lose. After all, limited means. I'm in an environment with church leaders. I'm idealistic enough to think that they were all operating principally for the good of what I perceived to be social justice and who God was. I really had a vision of a church where we could be young and influence the power long before the saying had come, "Speak truth unto power." We were doing it, speaking truth unto power.
I've got a picture here of you in front of the nation's capital. You are the only African American that went on the Bethany Caravan. 1964.
That's me.
A young African American woman spreading God's word, but in the midst of dangerous times as the bus traveled through the South.
When we got to Nashville on the caravan, we were going to the Parthenon, and the little girl named Sherry, who was no more than 3 years old, was near me because they said, "Charlotte, if we have any problem, you can act like you're the maid as we go to the Parthenon so you will not be attacked."
How did that make you feel?
Numb. Very sad.
How does it make you feel today?
Still sad. This is one of the purposes of the caravan, to immerse young people in what was happening in this nation, that everyone knew that America was not going to be the same because of the struggle for human dignity. So it was at times mind-blowing. It was painful. And they let me cry. At times, it just let me look out the window as we were going.
The growth from that experience, that month, had to be like 10 years of spiritual growth.
That growth would change my identity.
How?
How I looked, not only my worldview, but there's something bigger than myself to live for. And as Dr. King said, to die for.
Harris loved living and learning, but she got an unexpected assignment in college.
I got to class early, and I sat down, and the Shekinah glory came through the room, literally. It wasn't just sunlight, it was the Shekinah glory. And I sat there, didn't say anything. And just like we're talking, a voice came and said, "You will preach my gospel." And he would remind me when I had was finishing up my master's in education. Remind me, do you remember that you promised me you would go to seminary?
But take us back to that Sunday, January 22nd, 1984. 6 p.m., the church you grew up in, McCarty, and you're being ordained.
That morning I had been to church, and Claudia Farmer had gathered the children. And I bring this up, the children of the Sunday school, and they had come into the ladies' parlor. She sat the children down. There were 50 to 75 children. And she said, "Today we're going to see Charlotte. She's going to be ordained into Christian ministry." And I was overwhelmed because I understood the passing of the torch to the next generation. On that day, it was a celebration. It was a journey. It was real. And it has, even in my darkest hour, when I wanted to give it all back, say, "You can go call somebody else, Lord," it is that ordination that calls me back to say, "Gotta keep going."
And going she did, as she was called to the Disciples of Christ National Office in Indianapolis in 1986. The highlight for Harris? Working with the group Mother to Mother.
Advocacy for poor women who were white and black, and the advocacy of the church being at the table to speak on behalf of the poor. That was what excited me about that ministry. That was up my alley.
You are a living example of it's not just what we can get from God, it's what we can do for God.
The simple testament when the lawyers came to Jesus, what is required? Jesus says to love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's a tall order. And then to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. I'm still learning to do that.
The Christian Church Disciples of Christ was founded on principles of unity in Christ, communion, and baptism. But disciples have not always been unified. Reverend Harris talks about disciples, history, race, culture, age, and sexual orientation, where we're going, where we are, and where we've been. This is her story. This is history. Going to bring up a name. Campbell. The subject, slavery.
Alexander Campbell could be diplomatic, but he was holding together a church shaped by the policies of its time, and he knew it. Now, he had affirmed the fugitive slave law, and as you so aptly put it, but his sister was running the Underground Railroad.
She took a stand.
Yeah, he let his slaves go, but he was trying to hold together slavery. Our church prides itself in not dividing, but our church, in its manifestations, had derisive and dividing policies about slavery and the African American presence.
I'm going to read something to you and get your thoughts. The Civil War, 1861. Thousands of disciples on both sides put on their uniforms and went to fight. Among them, Barton Stone Jr. and Alexander Campbell Jr., both officers in the Confederate Army. In the words of historian David Edwin Harrell, in the heat of passion, disciples killed their brethren.
The schizophrenic schism that you're talking about with Alexander Campbell and his sons was prevalent in all families and their slave children. So it is not surprising to find this divisiveness. It was not believed that there was an African culture. That's number one. And that would be reflective in our seminary trainings and our trainings in our colleges. Because Arnold Toynbee had written that African cultures had produced nothing in the annals of world history. In the Christian church, in the education of the South, it educated African Americans to be functionaries in the institutions to carry out the functions of others.
But then you fast forward a century to 1961, and we got the same problems. How did the church do things well, or how did it fail?
The church, as Dr. King said in his Birmingham letter, failed. That's why he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail. Because it should have been the headlights for social change. The issue was not just race. The issue was, am I human? And until America grapples with that, the race question is out of the picture. The healing ministries of anti-racism, pro-reconciliation, have their marching orders.
Slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, and now the rights of the LGBTQ community. The church has struggled with all of these issues at one time or another. Reverend Harris's advice to the church: keep praying, keep loving, and most of all, keep talking.
It forces us to have to take the inaugural address of Jesus serious that was given in Luke 4. It forces us to listen to Amos again. Let justice roll down water. It forces us. You can't help it. I was once told, Charlotte, you ought to forget reconciliation and anti-racism. Because, we're not going to have that on the agenda. And I turned to the person and said, I got news for you. In Southern California, if we don't get some answers posed by pro-reconciliation and anti-racism, there will be no church.
Let's just say you've been real about the history of the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. There are some beautiful things about our history too.
the ecumenicity of the disciples. That's rich. The diversity of beliefs, moving beyond the walls to see there's a larger scope of the church, and how it influences communities. Disciples afforded me travel throughout the United States, not only by participation in the General Assemblies, but when I had to go on representative meetings on multicultural ministries, that afforded me the opportunity to see cultures.
Your worldview was really shaped by discipleship.
Well, yes, because discipleship was not just the ministry. Remember, that's why Christian education people will tell you, if you take a young person when they're in middle school and begin to shape their theological understandings, that's the most important and viable time to attract young people.
Communion is central to the disciples of Christ. The table is for everyone, but it takes on even more meaning than that for you.
It's been the one place I celebrate not only inclusion, but it's the table of freedom. When I fall on my knees, oh Lord, have mercy on me. And that's inclusion. It was not only inclusion from our Lord, but it was breaking bread, and at the same time, it was the train of freedom and the ancestors moving to Canada.
Also central to the disciples of Christ Christian Church, our sacrament, baptism.
The emerging to go into the water of depth and come out renewed. That experience that I had when I was 12 was pivotal in understanding what it was for Jesus in his resurrection. And I remembered the day of my baptism, of recording and playing in my head the words at Jesus' baptism. This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased. And my question that day is, dear God, what do you do with daughters? Are you well pleased? And that's the question I've always asked. I hope you're well pleased.
Reverend Harris' passion for social justice started with a spark, and it turned into a flame as she organized protests in support of youth here at McCarty and against the Vietnam War at the Regional Assembly in 1969. The war on racism and equal rights for all is never ending. Reverend Harris has seen it and experienced it firsthand. Reconciliation and the church and racism. This is Reverend Charlotte Harris. This is her story. This is history.
I hope I've given some practicality to how you do racism. Agitate, study, report to constituency groups, visualize, stay in tune with the society that you're dealing with.
Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Which comes first?
The affliction comes first. You're going to afflict the affliction, and then the sparks are going to fly. You have to be careful though when sparks fly. You don't want just a knee-jerk reaction. You want the long haul.
For those in social justice, how do we separate our emotion and not shoot from the hip and say things that are coming from our anger and not from our heart? How do we discern?
I think you have to have a moment of anger, and you have a right to have your anger. But how you process it to action becomes very important. First thing, you have to cry. You have to have a safe place, and where you holler, scream unto the Lord.
So your take on it is take action after you react. Deal with your emotion and then use your heart and your mind.
And let your emotion fuel your action and move. One of the things in the slave culture you realize is that they were not free. But when they were singing their understanding of God, they understood that one day they'd be free. They didn't act just from the moment.
And it took just one moment, just after 6 p.m. on April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed. A moment that would change Harris's life forever.
I was in class. Martin Luther King Hall. I forgot it was an education class. My friends had come up the steps and they said, get a hold of Charlotte. And when class was over, one was on one side and another one was on another side. And they walked me out the hallway, down the steps, and they told me the news. My body went numb.
When did you take action?
After making a commitment to myself that the principles that he had given his life for, I will have internalized them so that I can do them without thinking about them. See, Dr. King wasn't just a minister of the gospel. He was a philosopher, a teacher, a scholar, an activist, a husband, a father. He was life and blood. And I say that because those who may be looking years from now need to get away from the legend, take time, and get to know the man.
And you actually got to see him speak.
1960, Wrigley Field. My daddy took me, and I heard Dr. King speak. First of all, he was the cadences of his speech would grab you. Then the substance would get you. And how he can walk across the spectrum of history with such ease and sit you down in his basic understanding of the human predicament. Because Dr. King would say, we will all perish as fools if we don't learn how to live like brothers. Beloved community is how we work together and share together in this world.
In your life story, you describe the church as, quote, just for the middle, high class, and it keeps black people and the marginalized trained.
We're talking about the human, treating people as humans. And as humans, they have the potential to develop their human capacities and talents so that they are capable of providing a wholesome environment and education for their families. We have to realize is that in America, all of us are sick. because it's not wholesome. It is not wholesome that anybody has been taught that in order to make myself great, I have to lessen you. That's the premise for bullying.
Why is it so important to have an identity in Christ while you're fighting for social justice?
Because social justice does not just nourish your soul. You've got to have the whole package. It nurses you. It helps to balance you. It helps for you, your sanity to nourish yourself. You got to go inward and deep so that you will have a spring of water that wells up that you can drink from. Because this is hard work. Don't get self-important. It's not about you. It's very much bigger than you.
The world right now and its problems are somewhat overwhelming. What to fight for. And that overwhelming factor makes a lot of people go, no, I can't do any of it.
You don't try to take on the big world. Your church can't take on all of the menus and the different programs that social justice presents to you. But if you do one thing well, do it well. If you're going to advocate for farm labor, do it well. One program, not 10.
What message do you want to leave with the people that are watching this video?
I want everyone to know that Christian witness, though personal, it's also collective, intentional, and in the larger community of faith. And whatever your circumstances that you are born into, you can and will make a difference. We're co-creators. We've been asked to take care of the earth, to work and to walk humbly with our God, to do justice and love.